Somewhere beneath the surface of the most photographed lake in America, there is a place where light stops behaving the way it should, where the cold stops your skin from feeling anything after 90 seconds, and where objects that fall in do not rot. They do not decay. They do not disappear. In March of 1991, a small team pointed a camera into that darkness expecting a ghost story. What came back on their monitor was worse than a ghost story because a ghost story can be explained away. What they found could not be. And once you understand why Lake Tahoe keeps everything it swallows, you will never look at that turquoise water the same way again. For most of the 20th century, Lake Tahoe was known for two things: its impossible clarity and its impossible depth. Straddling the California-Nevada border high in the Sierra Nevada, it sits at over 6,000 feet of elevation, and beneath its surface the lake bed drops away with a violence that most visitors never think about while they're renting paddleboards. It is the second deepest lake in the United States, plunging to depths that place it among the deepest bodies of fresh water on the entire continent. Locals talk about the clarity like it's a tourist brochure fact, something to put on a postcard. But here's where it gets worse. That clarity is not a gift. It is a warning sign that almost nobody reads correctly. Water that clear is water with almost nothing living in it to cloud it. Few nutrients, little algae, a lake so pure it becomes in its own way sterile. And sterile water at depth does something that most people never stop to consider. It stops the clock. Bacteria that would normally break down organic material cannot survive in water that cold, that oxygen poor, that far from sunlight. Divers and researchers who have spent decades around Tahoe have a phrase for what happens down there, a phrase that sounds almost folkloric until you realize it is describing an observed, documented phenomenon. They say the lake does not give back what it takes. Read that again. This isn't superstition, it's thermodynamics wearing a ghost story's clothes. By the late 1980s, this reputation had attracted the kind of person who cannot leave a mystery alone. Chris Nicholson was a filmmaker and explorer, and he had heard the same story that every longtime Tahoe local eventually hears in a bar or on a dock. Somewhere out there, resting upright on the lake floor, was a ship that should not still exist. The SS Tahoe had once been the pride of the lake, a steamer that carried tourists and freight across the water in the early 20th century, gliding past the same shoreline where families now park their cars for summer vacations. And then, in 1940, with the age of steamships ending and the ship no longer profitable to run, its owners made a decision that would echo for 50 years. They stripped it of anything valuable. And they sank it. Deliberately, on purpose. Sent it to the bottom of the coldest, clearest, most merciless lake in the country, and let the depths swallow it whole. For half a century, nobody went looking. The technology to search hundreds of feet down in near freezing water simply didn't exist for amateur explorers. And even professional survey teams had little reason to prioritize a scuttled tourist boat over the dozens of other mysteries competing for funding and attention. But Nicholson wasn't interested in easy targets. He assembled a team, secured remotely operated vehicle technology capable of withstanding both the pressure and the temperature at depth, and in March of 1991, they began lowering a camera into the water. And this is where everything changes. The first descent told them almost nothing. Sediment, darkness, the ROV's lights catching nothing but drifting particles, suspended in water, so still it looked less like a lake and more like a held breath. According to those present, there was a moment where the team believed they had already been fooled once, that the coordinates were wrong, that 50 years of silt and lake-bottom currents had buried the ship beyond recognition or dragged the debris field somewhere they hadn't searched. Exhaustion set in. Hours had passed, watching a monitor show nothing but black water and floating sediment. Then something in the room changed. The exhaustion lifted. Someone adjusted the recording equipment. The ROV was redirected, sent back down along a slightly different heading, and the vehicle began its second descent into the same crushing dark. Depth numbers climbed on the readout. The lake swallowed the machine layer by layer, the way it swallows everything, until the surface world felt impossibly far away. And then the bottom rose into the lights. At first there was only more sediment, then an edge, a line that was too straight, too deliberate to be a rock formation, and then, emerging out of the darkness the way a shape emerges from fog, the bow of a ship appeared, as though it had chosen the exact moment to become visible. The SS Tahoe stood upright on the lake floor, not capsized, not broken apart. Upright, the way it would have stood at a dock 50 years earlier, waiting for passengers who would never arrive. For several seconds, according to accounts from those in the room, nobody spoke. The ship was almost impossibly intact. Windows were still in their frames. Sections of railing remained standing. Deck structures rose out of the black water as though the vessel had not spent half a century at the bottom of an alpine lake, but had simply been left overnight, waiting to be reopened in the morning. Think about what that means. 50 years underwater, and the ship looked like it had been abandoned last week. This is not chaos. This is the lake's chemistry doing exactly what it always does. Because here is the deeper truth that most people never learn, the one that turns a shipwreck story into something far stranger. Lake Tahoe's cold, oxygen-thin, nutrient-starved depths don't just slow decomposition. In practice, at the depths involved, they can arrest it almost entirely. Wood does not rot the way it would in warmer, more biologically active water. Metal corrodes at a fraction of the normal rate, and organic material, all organic material, behaves the same way. The lake is, in the most literal sense, a natural preservation chamber. And once that fact settles in, the ship stops being the most unsettling part of the story. Because a lake that preserves wood and metal that well does not selectively spare shipwrecks. According to informed reporting from those who have spent decades investigating the lake's underwater terrain, camera footage and diver accounts over the years have documented far more than one historic vessel resting on the bottom. What most people are not seeing, because it rarely makes it into the postcard version of Tahoe, is that the same cold that kept the SS Tahoe's railings standing has kept other things down there too. Human remains, when they occur in cold, low oxygen, low bacterial water like this, do not decompose the way remains do almost everywhere else on Earth. They do not float back to the surface after bacterial gases build up, because the bacteria responsible for producing those gases largely cannot survive at that depth and temperature. This is why longtime search and rescue divers around Tahoe have repeated the same grim phrase for generations. The lake keeps what it takes. It is not poetry. It is documented behavior of cold water lakes at extreme depth, and Tahoe is one of the most extreme examples of it in the country. That single fact reframes everything about the region's decades of unresolved missing persons cases, every drowning that never produced a body, every search that was called off, not because rescuers gave up, but because the physics of the lake made recovery, in practical terms, close to impossible. For years, this was treated as local trivia, the kind of unsettling fact tour guides mention half-jokingly on boat rides. But here's where it gets worse. As underwater exploration technology has advanced, and as researchers have pushed further and deeper into parts of the lake that were previously unreachable, the trivia has started becoming evidence, and evidence changes everything. Which brings us to what has been happening far more recently, in the years since Nicholson's original expedition became public. Because the SS Tahoe was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much longer one. In the years that followed, independent researchers picked up where the original expedition left off, driven by a question that never fully went away. If one ship could sit that perfectly preserved for 50 years, what else was down there that nobody had looked at closely enough? One of the people who took that question seriously has spent recent years mapping sections of the lake floor that most surveys had simply skipped over, using camera rigs capable of reaching depths well beyond casual recreational diving limits. According to reporting on his work, he was warned early on not to expect much. Officials and prior researchers told him there wasn't going to be much life at that depth, that the water was too cold, too dark, too nutrient poor to support meaningful biology. And this is where the story took its next turn. It's difficult, he has said, to actually lower a camera to the bottom of Lake Tahoe and get a shot without something alive drifting through the frame. Shrimp, fish, some of them unexpectedly large, for water that deep and that cold. Life persists down there in a way that contradicts the lake's reputation as a lifeless void, and that contradiction alone should have been enough of a headline. But it wasn't the strangest thing his cameras found. Somewhere in the lake's midsection lies a massive underwater rock formation, rising roughly 400 feet from the floor, hidden entirely from view at the surface because it never comes close enough to break the water. Most visitors paddling across the lake's surface have no idea it exists directly beneath them. And near that formation, researchers have identified a deep crevasse running between two fault lines, a geological scar suggesting the lake's true depth and true structure may be more complex and in places deeper than official measurements have fully accounted for. Think about what that means for a lake already classified as the second deepest in the country. If the crevasse readings hold up under further survey, Tahoe may be hiding depths that current maps don't even show. None of this has happened in a vacuum either. Documentary crews have followed these expeditions specifically because the story kept escalating on its own without needing embellishment. A Los Angeles-based production team attached itself to the research after realizing, in their own words, that once filming began, they could finally start seeing what the lead researcher was actually uncovering, and the story evolved in real time in front of their cameras. That is not the behavior of a dead mystery. That is the behavior of an active one. And this is where the deeper, stranger layer of Tahoe folklore resurfaces, the layer that blurs the line between documented science and unverifiable legend, and it's important to be precise about which side of that line we're standing on. For decades, a rumor has circulated in diving communities that the famed oceanographic explorer Jacques Cousteau once descended into Lake Tahoe personally, and that, upon resurfacing, he told his crew, "The world is not ready to know what I saw," before insisting the footage be sealed away. It is one of the most repeated lines in all of Tahoe lore, It has been quoted in documentaries, whispered by dive instructors, treated as gospel by generations of curious tourists, and according to people who have spent nearly 2 decades working directly in this space, including those closely tied to lake conservation efforts, there is no actual evidence Cousteau was ever in Tahoe at all. Read that again. One of the most famous hidden truth stories about this lake appears to be, as far as anyone can verify, entirely fabricated. No dive logs, no footage, no corroborating crew testimony, just a quote that spread because it was too good not to repeat. That should be reassuring. It is not, because the existence of a fake mystery doesn't erase the real one sitting underneath it. If anything, it does something more unsettling. It shows how easily a genuine, documented phenomenon, a lake that mechanically, chemically, unavoidably preserves whatever sinks into its depths, got buried under decades of invented ghost stories. On to the point where researchers now have to spend time debunking Cousteau quotes instead of discussing crevasses and rock formations that are actually real, actually mapped, and actually still being explored as of the last research season. This is not chaos. This is what happens when a genuine scientific mystery becomes more marketable as folklore than as fact, and the folklore ends up crowding out the truth it was built on top of. What most people are not seeing is that the real story was never the myths. It was the physics. It was the chemistry of a lake so cold and so pure that it functions less like a body of water and more like a vault. A vault that opened once in 1991 to reveal a 50-year-old ship standing exactly as it had been left. A vault that has, in the years since, revealed a hidden 400-foot rock formation, a crevasse suggesting unmeasured depths, and populations of life persisting where none were supposed to survive. The escalation hasn't stopped there either. In the current research season, scientific teams working with academic institutions have been treating Lake Tahoe not as a graveyard of mysteries, but as an active laboratory, running structured studies across the lake's basin involving well over 1,000 participants, examining how encounters with the lake's sheer scale and stillness affect the human mind in real time. Preliminary findings from that research have reported measurable spikes in feelings of awe and happiness after only a couple of minutes spent in the presence of the water, an unintentional confirmation of something the lake's darker legends have always implied in a different way, that something about Tahoe reaches people on a level deeper than ordinary sightseeing. The same lake, capable of preserving a shipwreck for half a century, of hiding a 400-foot formation from public knowledge, of keeping remains at depths no rescue team can safely reach, is also capable of producing an almost immediate, measurable emotional shift in the people who stand at its edge. Both of those facts are true. Both of those facts are documented, and very few people ever hold them in their mind at the same time. That's the part of this story that should genuinely unsettle you, more than any ghost story ever could, because a natural formation that can quietly rewrite your emotional state within 2 minutes of exposure, that has been doing so to millions of visitors for over a century without their awareness, is not a passive backdrop. It is an active force. According to the researchers involved, the lake's scale seems to trigger something close to an instinctive psychological response, a recognition of vastness that most environments in modern life simply do not provide anymore. And the same instinct that makes people fall silent, slow their conversations, and feel suddenly connected to strangers beside them is possibly the same instinct that has kept generations of divers, filmmakers, and explorers returning to that same cold water again and again, chasing something they can feel more than they can explain. So where does that leave the original footage, the one that started all of this, the moment the recording team found the SS Tahoe standing upright in the dark? It leaves it exactly where it should be, as the clearest, best documented proof that this lake does not let go of what falls into it. Every rumor since then, every half-verified sighting, every whispered story about things seen deeper than any diver has safely gone, exists because that first piece of hard evidence proved the underlying premise true. The lake preserves. The lake hides. The lake reveals only what it chooses to reveal on a timeline that has nothing to do with human curiosity or human urgency. And here is what nobody has fully answered yet. The question that the current generation of researchers is still chasing as their expeditions continue. If a 50-year-old ship could sit that intact, if a 400-foot rock formation could remain unknown to the public for this long, if a crevasse between two fault lines is only now being properly surveyed, what else has been sitting down there this entire time? Cold, dark, and undisturbed, waiting for someone with the right equipment and the right amount of patience to finally point a camera at it? The independent researcher currently mapping the lake's floor has said the discoveries feel endless, that every expedition uncovers something the previous one didn't have the technology or the access to find. That is not the language of a closed case. That is the language of a story that is still actively unfolding, expedition by expedition, frame by frame, in water cold enough to stop time and clear enough to make you believe, for a moment, that you can see all the way to the bottom. You can't. Nobody ever has. Not completely. And maybe that's the most important thing this entire story reveals. Not a monster, not a government cover-up, not a sealed Cousteau tape that never existed in the first place, but something quieter and far harder to dismiss. A lake that behaves less like scenery and more like a witness, holding on to everything it has ever seen, waiting for the technology, the patience, or the willingness of the living to finally come back down and ask it to explain itself. The next expedition is already being planned. Nobody knows yet what it will find, and that more than any ghost story ever could, is exactly why people keep going back into the dark.